Hello and welcome to the Foggy Mountain Press's brand new audiobook series. I'm Grace Edgewood, author of the Fog Saga, and I'm glad to welcome you into Book 1, Cole Magnus. Today we're going to dive headfirst into Chapter 1, New Town, New Me. There was no way this was safe. Jumping from a train was dangerous, especially when chased by angry ticket examiners. I urged her to run faster as we darted around the disgruntled passengers. I jumped over the handbag of a wealthy woman and smiled as I grabbed the bag's handles. "Harold!" the woman howled. "He stole my purse!" The man with her did not seem all that worried. He looked as if he'd wished that I'd grabbed her instead. I dug through the bag as we ran and took out the velvet coin purse. I pushed the coin purse into my pocket and threw the bag behind me, without looking back. I felt no small amount of joy when I heard the man chasing me grunt on impact. She had reached the end of the car, and I watched as she struggled with the door handle. I tried to slow down. I barely avoided slamming into her, and instead let my shoulder grind me to a halt on the cold steel of the door. I wrestled with the handle until it swung free. Several of the passengers screamed as the door pulled inward and the wind whipped in around us. She jumped over the gap that revealed the ground rushing beneath us and kept running. I turned to catch a glimpse of our pursuers over my shoulder. They were gaining ground. I jumped after her and balanced carefully on the metal pin that joined the train cars together. I stretched backwards and slammed the door shut in the man's face. I scurried inside the next car and fastened the door shut behind me. "Sorry, excuse me," she yelled as we barreled into the dining car. People gasped and moved to either side. "Out of the way!" I barreled as I ducked under a waiter's tray. People jumped out of the aisle and dove into seats. In the last car, we found only an elderly woman napping in a seat. I jumped over her bag and kept running. At the end of the car, we watched the tracks fly underneath us. I ran to the left side of the train and gripped the rail into my ribs. I leaned out and threw my head into the wind. The air was bitterly cold. If I swung out far enough, I could see the name of the railway company painted in sun-faded red on the side. I squinted through the wind and towards the town in the distance. The sign bearing the town's name was growing rapidly. A valley filled with rustling maiden's grass swept down below us. "Stop!" someone yelled from behind me. A quick glance over my shoulder confirmed that the ticket examiner and the two men in black clothes were closing in behind us. I left her peeling over the railing and ran back to the door. The men vaulted over the old lady's bags just as I bolted the door shut. I could feel the heat of the car leaking out from under the door. The icy metal bit at my exposed toes. I joined her again by the rail. She turned to me, fear prominent in her eyes. The wind whipped her hair over her head. Her hand fell immediately to rest on mine. Her fingertips were cold against my hand. Her face begged me to come up with a plan. It was beginning to spit snow. If we wanted to get away undetected, the tracks in the snow were not going to be helpful. "We'll jump!" I yelled over the roar of the wind. She nodded and gripped the rail with white knuckles. I maneuvered her to the side of the train that did not have sharp sticks and boulders waiting to crush us. In other words, it was the side with the softest-looking grass. "The train's slowing down!" she yelled. The wind took her words and flung them away from us. Pointlessly, I yelled back, "It's stopping soon!" I looked for an opening in the awaiting valley. They would catch us for sure if we waited for the train to come to a complete stop. I looked back over the rail and towards the town. I could almost make out the town's name by now. Clanging and shouting ensued behind us. The guards had finally caught up. The screech of the train whistle and the hiss of the brakes cut through the air. "Get ready to jump!" She grabbed my hand, the fear plain on her face. I could finally hear above the roar of the wind. "Don't worry," I shouted as we ducked under the chain that guarded the exit. "It'll be fun." I gave her hand a squeeze. The guards were still trying to wrestle the door open. We had to hurry. We stood with our backs to the rail and watched the window of time closing. 3, I counted down. 2, she continued. 1. Then we jumped. We tumbled violently down the grassy hill beside the train tracks. I rolled head over heels until I skidded to a painful stop at the bottom of a dell, where our bodies were hidden among the high reeds of grass. Our quick descent had beheaded several of the fluffy, white stalks, and I knew I was covered in the fine hairs that were now dusting the entire valley. We came to rest in the shadow of a sign that I had seen from the train. I raised my head to read what it said. "Welcome to Carlin," it practically shouted at me, with its curvy font and aggressive red and gold color scheme. I remained flat on my back, with one leg drawn up underneath me. I stared at the blue sky and tried to catch my breath. But I was startled when the reeds behind me began to rustle. I craned my neck, just as her eager face popped up from the weeds. I smiled in recognition as all fear vanished from our faces. For the first time in a long time, Lyla laughed. "Let's do that again," she gasped. Lyla picked the blades of grass from her hair and threw them into the wind. She stretched in the tall grasses that surrounded us. I smiled and sat up slowly. We'd made it. We hadn't jumped too late and hit the sign. We hadn't jumped too early and caught the tree. I grinned wider as I heard a train whistle announce its arrival in Carlin. I laid back down in the dirt and grass to rub my tired joints. They all begged for a break from the lifting, running, jumping, climbing, and all the other strainful things that catching the train had required. Lyla, however, was ready for the next adventure. As she danced around me excitedly, the sun caught her bronze hair and reflected back streams of red gold. If our faces weren't enough to give away our blood relation, her hair matched mine and our mother's. Unlike me, her eyes belonged only to our father. She had a soft gaze that mimicked a crisp winter sky, while I had eyes the color of autumn leaves. According to Lyla, I had gold flecks in my eyes, which reflected my inner worth. Or, so she says. I think she reads too much poetry. I watched her slender fingers brush the tips of the grass and caress the tender snowflakes. Those hands had crafted her own dolls and clothes, but her smile never wavered. I looked down at my own hands. I saw a bloody knuckle and a crooked finger. Memories of the guard that I had punched to avoid getting caught on the train, and other desperate things that I had done resurfaced, but I pushed them away. Focusing on the past wouldn't help me survive right now. I suppressed a groan as I hefted myself off the ground. Now that I was on my own 2 feet, Lyla ran toward me. "Tell me again," she said eagerly. I rolled my eyes. "I've told you 1,000 times." Her eyes pleaded with me to continue. I sighed, and the puff of my breath was visible. "We're going to Rolling Acres. There, the only thing in the country is mountains. Right now, I bet those peaks are just bursting with color. There'll be valleys full of nothing but wildflowers. You could roam for miles and not find another person. We'll make ourselves a little house and plant some food. And then, when winter comes, we'll sit on the back porch and we'll watch the snow fall slowly from the mountains. There won't be anyone to chase us or hunt us down. We'll be free." Lyla smiled and looked towards the little town that was our last stop before crossing the border. She grabbed my hand and gave me an encouraging squeeze. It wasn't much of a walk to the first cluster of buildings. The farther we ventured into town, the longer the walk would be back to the train, and we had to sneak on for just one more trip. Rolling Acres was just on the other side of the Calf Killer River. While we were still in Lean Gap, I overheard a traveler talk about the vast mountains there. He had made it sound like a man could live there for a song. I'd been pickpocketing the man at the time, and after his revelation, I withdrew his wallet and scurried off to tell Lyla of the plan that was forming in my brain. We could be free, if only we could make it to Rolling Acres. Its vast terrain and difficult navigation would make it impossible for the local law enforcement to find us. It held the promise of freedom, the plea of normalcy to return. We blended into the crowd, but always kept our hands clasped to each other. Judging from the dirty streets and the lack of political banners and slogans, it was safe to say that we were at least a day's walk from the nearest big city. The town had once been a bright and colorful seaside village. The fabric awnings had been complementing shades of gold and crimson. Today, only the sun-bleached remnants clung to the skeletal remains of the buildings. The storefronts were tattered and begged for dusting. Snow had gathered on the windowsills and on the roofs of the houses in the distance. A carriage rolled past us, and judging from the fair-skinned inhabitants in green attire, they were executives from Lean Gap. Lean Gap was a several-hour train ride to the west, usually far enough to keep the Lean Gap Authority at bay. I'd visited Lean Gap several times, all mostly for illegal reasons. The Duke who lived there had a price on my head that would turn even a noble's head. I had stolen from him and humiliated his family in the process, but I think his daughter enjoyed the excitement. But Castle Farfally's walls seemed to shrink quickly. His guards were ruthless and eager to serve his unpaid judgment. They hadn't been kind, and I still bore the scars from that misadventure. I never made the mistake of getting caught again. His gallows waited for the day that my neck would rest in his noose. He wouldn't have pursued me this far. Would he? That was months ago. He could have quickly replenished his storehouses and stables by now. My eyes tricked me into seeing threats in the sun-filled stalls and mercenaries in the shadows. Amid my reminiscing, I had squeezed Lila's hand painfully tight. "Cole," she said, shaking me out of a daze. "Someone's following us." I let go of her hand and cautiously looked around. When she thought I wasn't looking, she rubbed her fingers. "Look at those beautiful melons," I exclaimed. She took the hint and wandered to the stall that was selling fruit. She stayed near the back of the crowd so I could see her no matter where I was from town square. I walked to a tall storefront with my hands in my pocket, trying not to look suspicious. I glanced around the open courtyard, and no one seemed to take any particular interest in me, so I meandered to the dark space between 2 buildings, standing silently, straining my ears to see if someone was approaching. When no one followed me into the shadows, I began to look for a different plan. I looked up at the tall brick building as a small smile spread across my face. It was time to test my climbing skills. I slid my fingers into the gaps in the stone and smiled a little more as I slid my toes into the small spaces between the cemented stones. It was moments like this that made my attire so fitting. My shirt was too big, so it was tucked into my pants, that were also a size off. Cords were tied around my shins and down to my ankles to keep the ragged edges down. It made jumping from moving trains, scaling rickety buildings, and dodging unseen attackers much easier when I wasn't tripping over my own clothes. I gripped the brick and began to climb. Once I reached the thatched roof, I paused, letting the winter breeze brush over me. I grabbed the edge and pulled myself over with the skill of a dead fish. I moved from beam to beam, trying not to fall through the dried grass. Stepping carefully to the edge, I crouched down to avoid being seen and scanned the area. I grabbed the edge of the roof and tried to keep my footing on the unsteady straw. Lyla stood innocently by the fruit stall, smelling an apple. 100 people bustled around on the harsh winter's day. The smell that rose from the market was repulsive enough to make me gag. The sense of sweat and animal droppings mixed with the raw meat that was being sold. I scanned the throngs of people, looking for danger. A butcher was taking out his frustration on a slab of meat. There was the baker's son, who was lugging sacks of flour. There were very few children running around, but families gathered and gossiped. Prominent men dressed in black stood by the pub, but there didn't seem to be any immediate threats. They appeared to be doing the same thing I was. One of them jumped a little, and then shoved the other one as I watched. He pointed to the fruit market, and they all moved as one. They began shoving and elbowing people aside and making their way forward. Startled, I looked at Lyla, and she searched the ground for me. Should I wave to get her attention, or would that also attract unwanted attention? Men were headed towards her, but they didn't see me. I needed to keep it that way. I leaned out over the roof to find the fastest route to her. I saw the fabric awning, lazily swinging in the wind a fair way down from where I squatted, and decided to take my chances. I took a steadying breath and jumped. My stomach rose into my throat as I fell. The fabric was weather-worn and thin, so it barely gave any resistance. I hit feet first and rolled to even out the point of impact. I hit the stones hard, but Lyla was at the forefront of my mind, not my injuries. A pile of snow slid off the roof and down my back. I saw the men only because of how uniquely tall they were. I knew there was no way I could fight them. They were tall, muscular, and obviously trained. I, on the other hand, was scrawny, average height, and my only experience came from a life on the run. I had made my living through deceit and tricks. This would be no different. A plan came to me as I bolted up. The fabric awning had been shredded as I fell through it, but one large piece remained pinned under me. I grabbed the thin cloth and wrapped it around my hand. I got up and rubbed my shins. The men in black had reached the storefront. My feet slapped the dirt and the ice-crusted cobblestones as I ran down the street. I didn't see Lyla, but she was clever. She had hidden somewhere. My only problem was that I was not with her, and she had hidden so well I couldn't find her. The men were pushing their way through the multitudes. I ran as fast as I could to the crowd. I dodged around people and around children who stood gawking at the action. I pushed past as many people as I could until I reached the line of men sweeping the crowds. The men had left a large wake for me to follow, but I couldn't move past them. With my heart nearly beating out of my chest, I unwrapped the fabric from my hand. The cold air stung my fingers as I draped the fabric over my head, holding the ends of the snow-dampened cloth tightly under my chin. I hunched over and diverted into the crowd. Unsuspecting pockets and purses volunteered valuables as I meandered past the rich folk. I borrowed a worn traveling cloak from a stranger. He yelled and chased after me, but he was old and too frail to put up much of a fight. I was young and ready for adventure. I got a bowl from another store and put my newfound riches in it. "Give your spare change," I pleaded, coating my voice in lies. "Money to the poor and needy." I stumbled and fell in front of the men. I landed directly on one of their feet. I made a show of standing up and brushing it off. "Please forgive me, sir." I bumbled and stumbled around, causing as big a scene as possible. I finally tripped and spilled all of my coins. "Get out of my way," he barked. "Begging your pardon, sir, but who are you looking for?" A little girl and a boy menace. "You know them?" I bobbed my cloaked head enthusiastically. Yes, sir, I does. She ran that-a-way." I pointed back towards the train. "Sir, isn't the train scheduled to make a stop soon?" I heard the man's breathing accelerate. He ran towards the train station faster than I thought possible for a man that size. I bent down to collect the coins and watched them run away. They were all dressed similarly. Each wore loose pants for running, a tight-fitting shirt for climbing, and shoes that fit snugly. Their hats veiled their eyes in shadow. I continued with my charade of picking up the coins and stumbling around. The coins were scattered all across the hard-packed dirt and stone. Puddles claimed a few, and I wasn't eager to stick my hand into the frigid, discolored water. A small, soft hand touched mine when I reached for a coin. "Thanking you kindly, ma'am. The least I can do for the man who saved my life more times than I can count." I winked at her. "Meet me behind the bakery when you can," I whispered. She nodded and handed me the bowl. I slipped a couple of coins into her hand as she scurried away. I took it and headed east, while she walked west, towards the smells of baking bread. I returned most of the money I'd taken, then ticked through the list of things we needed. I felt the bag I'd taken from the rich woman in the train thump against my leg. Its weight gave me a small reassurance that we weren't out of moves just yet. I found an empty burlap sack that the apples had come in, and walked around the square. I couldn't find the old man I'd taken the cloak from, so I just took off the hood and left the front clasped around me. I tried to spread out the money the best I could. I was a talented thief, but I didn't like stealing from people who were struggling to survive, much like me. Maybe this new town was a chance to turn over a new leaf, find a job, sit down some roots. It was a nice thought. As I snuck through the back alleys and around the shady businesses, I knew I was set in my ways. Perhaps Rolling Acres would be different. If I could just get across the river into the mountains, everything would change for us. She was waiting for me amid the heat of the ovens and the heavenly smells of dough. She slowly emerged from the shadows. She held out the bread that was a few days old and the rest of the coins. As nervous as the previous encounter made me, I was grateful to be in her presence again. I ran to her. "Are you okay?" I asked frantically. "I'm fine," she said, laughing. She stopped abruptly and said scornfully, "Cole, you're bleeding." She pointed to my skinned elbows. "I'm fine, but I think we should probably get out of here." Agreed. I looked around for the men in black, or another issue. Where? I ran through a list that I'd been making in my mind as I poked through town. I looked down at my pocket. Any good thief would be able to tell you that I had money in that pocket, but it wasn't nearly as much as I had started out with. The bag of coins that tied at my waist was now small enough to fit into my pocket. Our buffer was shrinking significantly. "There's an inn south of here. I'd love to stay there, but those men were looking specifically for a little girl, and Lila's wide eyes told me she wasn't listening. Men are coming over here, and they're glaring at you," she whispered. "Ignore them. Let's walk the other way," I said calmly, but inwardly my heart was pounding. We walked swiftly back towards the market. Sometimes I wanted nothing more than to be out of the public eye, far away from the open places. Maybe that's what made Rolling Acres so appealing. But there were other times, like now, when it was more helpful to have so many people around. 2 children could easily get lost in a crowd this size. We did our best to avoid the hulking figures that dwelled in the shadows. I counted 8 in view, but more lurked in the shadows like beady-eyed scavengers. I had tucked the scrap of fabric that I'd used as a disguise into my apple sack. My fingers twitched uneasily, wanting to be helpful. I wanted to rip out the fabric and cover Lila's head so badly. I vainly wished to grab her hand and run, but I knew that would only draw attention to us. What we needed most of all was to be ordinary. My heart skipped a beat when I saw 2 buildings so close together they were practically one. We slipped between them into freedom. There was a rickety wooden fence behind the buildings that we scaled without a problem. From there were tiny houses and rolling hills. It was all very quaint and simple-looking, rather appealing given the life I lead. I kept glancing behind us, expecting some evil entity to appear. After several false alarms, I decided no one was following us. We passed an old farmhouse with a whistling tea kettle howling from inside. There was a worn fence that took us around to the barn. I saw the hen house from a distance and took the chance. We jumped the fence and ran to the tiny structure in the fading light. I hoped no one was at the rear window to see our desperate escape attempt. We came upon an old hen house that the owner wasn't using. The hay was dry and clean enough to use. I laid the cloth down for Lyla to sleep on. She smiled when I curled up next to her. "No guard tonight?" "We're in an abandoned chicken coop, about half an hour's walk from town. I'd say we're safe enough." A branch snapped nearby. Lyla tried to hide her laugh when I stiffened. Out of instinct, I hopped up to peer around. I couldn't see anyone, other than the old woman who was coming out of the back door to stand on their back porch. She stood there for a moment, gazing into the night. I held my breath until another voice called out from the flickering halo coming from the door. "What's the matter, Cecile?" "I thought I saw something," she hollered back to her husband. She meandered back to her rocking chair and sat down. An elderly man with a short beard came to sit beside her. He puffed on a pipe, and she leaned her head back. Other than the occasional creak of the chair, they made no other noise. Cows munched nearby. An old silo groaned in the wind. Snowflakes were growing in size, so the snow would be stopping soon. The magnificent white contrasted greatly to the stark of the night. I sat back down, and Lyla gave me a hint of a smile. "Safe, huh?" She gently hit my arm. "Relax." She laid back down and waited for me to follow. I swiveled my head one last time, and then laid beside her. It was frigid. She shivered against the bite of the wind and snuggled closer to me. I draped the stolen cloak over us and wrapped my arms around her. She nestled her head on my chest, and I could hear her every breath. I knew she was counting the beats of my heart. "Cole?" She shifted to look up at me. I blinked hard. Watching the snow dance outside had nearly lulled me to sleep. "Yes?" She readjusted on my chest, hugging her cold fingers to her chest. "Why were those men after us?" I paused. I had an idea, but I didn't want to scare her. "I don't know," I said. "Some lord or duke had probably gotten tired of my shenanigans and sent his men out to find me. Once I was caught, I would be imprisoned. and if he was feeling particularly ill, I might be whipped. And beaten. I probably would be anyway. She sat up and looked around. She looked down at me, worry plain in her eyes. But they won't catch us, right? She asked, panic seeping into her tone. I blinked hard, trying not to fall asleep. Of course not. I shifted so our eyes were mere inches from each other. I could never let that happen. She laid back down and snuggled closer to me. What's our next step from here? She whispered. A smile brought on by nostalgia crossed my face. This was a game we used to play as kids. When life got too hard to bear, we would simplify it into one choice at a time. One baby step that turned into 100. Eventually, the combined effort would get us to a logical end. It was easier to not get burdened with life when your outlook told you the giant steps were really just several smaller ones. I tucked my arm behind her and the other behind my own head. We'll go back to Carlin, catch the train, and then we'll be home free. She sighed happily and snuggled closer. While getting comfortable, she poked me with her icy toes. My leg recoiled from the unwanted cold. Gosh, Lyla, warm up your feet a little bit, she laughed. Good night. I felt her long sigh of warm breath on my chest. I love you, she whispered as if we were children again. I smiled even though she couldn't see me. I love you, Lyla. Sleep well. Her breathing grew deeper. I was left alone, staring up at the darkened roof of the chicken coop. All I could do was lay in silence and listen to the sound of the wind. And that was Chapter 1 of Cole Magnus, Book 1 of the Fog Saga. I'm Grace Edgewood, thanking you for listening. Join us next time as we begin Chapter 2, Back Alley Charades.